Okay, so you want to own a tavern in a pirate port. Picture the postcard version first, because it's the one everybody already has in their head. A captain fresh off a raid, pockets stuffed with Spanish silver, rolls an entire barrel of wine out into the street and invites the whole town to drink from it. Men buy rounds for taverns full of strangers. A single night of gambling burns through what took months to steal. Contemporary visitors to Port Royal, Jamaica in the late 1600s wrote home describing exactly this. Streets running with spilled wine, fortunes disappearing in an evening, a town so drunk on plunder that one appalled minister claimed even the local parrots had picked up the slurred speech of the taverns beneath their perches. That's the legend, and for once, the legend is basically true. What the legend leaves out is the tavern keeper standing behind all of it, running numbers in his head while the party happens in front of him, because a smart tavern owner in a pirate port wasn't in the rum business. He was in the credit business, lending against men who had a genuinely terrible life expectancy, and he had to get his money before the sea, the noose, or the next hurricane got to the customer first. Let's build the actual business in the actual place with the actual numbers, because both of history's two real pirate boomtowns left behind a documented paper trail, and one of them, astonishingly, left behind a physical crime scene, still sitting on the seabed exactly where it sank. Start in Port Royal, Jamaica, when an English fleet seized the island from Spain in 1655. The new colonial government made a calculated, and at the time genuinely controversial decision. They didn't have nearly enough soldiers to defend the harbor from a Spanish counterattack, so they invited buccaneers and privateers, armed sailors who'd fight under an English license in exchange for a cut of whatever they captured, to use Port Royal freely as their home base, in return for keeping the Spanish Navy too busy and too broke to come looking. It worked. Within a few decades, Port Royal wasn't just a fort with a harbor, it was, according to modern historians who have studied it, arguably the largest and wealthiest English town anywhere in the New World, built almost entirely, as one scholar bluntly put it, on servicing the needs of privateers. And that meant taverns, an almost absurd number of them, packed onto a spit of land barely 51 acres across. By the early 1690s, Port Royal held somewhere around 6,500 to 8,000 people crammed into roughly 2,000 buildings, many of them multi-story brick construction that wouldn't have looked out of place in London. Contemporary accounts put the tavern density at something like one drinking establishment for every 10 to 20 residents, an almost unbelievable ratio, and in a single year, 1661, the town issued 40 separate new tavern licenses. Do the arithmetic on that kind of saturation, and you get an immediate business problem. If there's a tavern on nearly every corner, rum alone cannot be your competitive edge because your rum is the same rum as the tavern next door, bought off the same ships from the same sugar island. You need something the tavern next door doesn't have. What the smartest operators had was an understanding of exactly how a privateer or a pirate actually got paid. And that's the part that turns this from a bar story into an economics story. Crews on these ships almost never worked for a wage. They worked under a set of written articles, agreed and signed before the voyage, that divided any plunder into shares, a captain getting several shares, a quartermaster and specialists getting 1.5, an ordinary sailor getting 1, sometimes with a fixed cash payment written in for the loss of an eye, a hand, or a leg. A genuinely early form of disability insurance built into a criminal enterprise. The whole system ran on a principle sailors of the era summed up bluntly: no prey, no pay. If the voyage came up empty, nobody got a wage at all. But if it succeeded, the entire crew's income for the last several months, sometimes the entire year, arrived all at once in a single lump sum the moment the ship's cargo hold was converted into coin back at port. And here's a detail that makes the tavern's role even clearer, because it comes straight from a surviving set of articles rather than a general impression of pirate life. Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful captains of the entire Golden Age, ran his ship under a written code in 1721 that specifically banned gambling aboard the vessel, ordered candles and lights out at 8 o'clock every night, and, most tellingly, ruled that any personal quarrel between two crew members had to wait until they were back on land, to be settled there by sword or pistol rather than aboard ship. Roberts also wrote a precise itemized compensation schedule into the same document: 600 pieces of 8 for the loss of a right arm, 500 for the left, the same again for a right leg, 400 for a left leg, 100 for an eye or a single finger. Put those provisions together, and you can see exactly what kind of ship Roberts was trying to run. A tight, disciplined, fire-conscious vessel where money disputes, drunkenness, and violence were actively pushed off the deck and onto dry land, because a wooden ship packed with drunk, armed men settling scores is a fire, and a mutiny waiting to happen, which means the ship's own rules were, in effect, exporting the entire gambling, dueling, and injury payout economy directly onto whichever port the crew came ashore in. The tavern didn't just happen to be where pirates spent their money. By the plain terms of documents like Roberts's articles, it was legally and deliberately the only place left where they were allowed to. That payment structure is the whole engine behind the wine in the street stories and it's not really a mystery of character or recklessness once you see the mechanics. A man in this line of work knew, better than almost anyone in the 17th century Atlantic world, that his own odds of surviving to collect a second big payday weren't great. Disease, storms, a poorly aimed cannon, or eventually a length of rope at gallows point could end the whole arrangement at any time. An income that arrives in one enormous irregular lump for a customer who has every rational reason to believe there might not be a next payday produces exactly the spending pattern the records describe. Burn through it fast. Because slow, careful saving is a bet on a future the math doesn't really support. Here's where the tavern keeper's actual business model comes into focus, and it's more interesting than just being the last man standing when the coin ran out. Between voyages, once a crew had gone through its winnings, which by every contemporary account happened astonishingly quickly, those same men were still in Port Royal, still needed to eat, drink, and find lodging, and still had absolutely no cash. A tavern keeper who wanted repeat business rather than a one-time windfall followed by an empty room, extended credit, room, board, and drink against a man's promise to settle up out of his share of the next voyage. That's not just running a bar tab. That is underwriting a stranger's future criminal enterprise, in exchange for a claim on earnings that don't exist yet and might never exist at all if the next voyage came up empty or the ship never came back. It's genuinely closer to venture financing than hospitality, dressed up as hospitality because that's the only legal-looking shape the transaction could take. And when the voyage did pay off, the tavern keeper who'd extended that credit collected first before the sailor had a chance to spend it all over again somewhere else, which is exactly why cultivating loyal, indebted regulars mattered more than having the cheapest rum on the street. Rum and credit weren't the only lines on the ledger either. Port Royal's merchants and tavern keepers also functioned less formally as the town's fences and its bank. Plundered Spanish goods, cloth, tools, sugar, sometimes entire captured cargo holds needed somewhere to be warehoused, appraised, and quietly sold on, and taverns and the merchants clustered around them were a natural clearinghouse for exactly that kind of transaction. No questions asked being an implicit part of the service. And because so much actual gold and silver coin was constantly circulating through the town, straight off Spanish wrecks and captured treasure ships, contemporary accounts describe locals abandoning ordinary barter almost entirely in favor of hard specie for every transaction, down to the smallest purchase, which meant a tavern keeper handling that kind of cash volume was, functionally, also running an informal money-changing operation on the side. None of this was strictly legal in the way a modern bank or pawn shop is legal. All of it was tolerated because the tax revenue and bribes flowing from that same economy up to the colonial government kept London satisfied enough to look the other way, at least for a few very profitable decades. It's also worth understanding what was actually in the glass, because that explains why an entire barrel could be rolled into the street and given away without ruining the tavern keeper for the week. Rum wasn't a premium import shipped across an ocean at great expense. It was invented right there in the Caribbean out of garbage. Sugar planters on Barbados in the 1640s had been boiling cane juice down into sugar and throwing away the leftover sludge, a thick, practically worthless byproduct called molasses, until someone worked out that the molasses could be fermented and distilled into a rough, violently strong spirit. Early accounts called it kill devil because the stuff was strong enough that a hot climate and a hard day's drinking of it could apparently kill a man outright, and by the 1650s the Royal Navy itself had adopted rum as the standard daily ration for sailors serving in the Caribbean, replacing beer that spoiled too fast in the heat. In other words, the drink fueling Port Royal's legendary excess was, from the very start, a cheap way of turning sugar plantation waste into a sellable commodity, produced close by, priced accordingly, and available in a volume that made pouring an entire barrel into the street for goodwill a genuinely affordable piece of marketing rather than an act of financial madness. At the very top of this pyramid sat men like Henry Morgan, the most successful privateer to work out of Port Royal, who led devastating raids against Spanish strongholds across the Caribbean, was eventually knighted for it by the same crown that had unofficially sanctioned the whole arrangement, and ended his career as Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, dying in 1688, wealthy enough to be given a full state funeral in the town where he'd once been just another captain running up a bar tab. Morgan is the survivorship bias version of this story, the one man in 1,000 whose share of plunder compounded into a title and a fortune instead of a debt and an early grave. Most of Port Royal's regular customers were the opposite case, and the tavern keeper's whole business depended on there being a steady, renewable supply of exactly that kind of customer. Then, on the morning of June 7th, 1692, at 11:43 a.m., a time we know with genuinely eerie precision because a stopped pocket watch was recovered from the harbor floor centuries later, with its hands frozen at that exact moment, the ground underneath Port Royal simply stopped behaving like ground. Much of the town had been built on a narrow spit of loose, unconsolidated sand, and the earthquake that struck that day triggered a phenomenon called soil liquefaction, where violent shaking causes water trapped between grains of sand to build up so much pressure that solid ground briefly starts behaving like like a liquid. Eyewitnesses said the earth didn't crack open so much as it seemed to move like waves on the sea, and heavy brick buildings that had stood for decades simply sank, some of them nearly whole, straight down into ground that could no longer hold their weight before the water rushed back in over the top of them. Roughly 33 of the town's 51 acres disappeared beneath the harbor within minutes. About 2,000 people are estimated to have died immediately, and as many as 3,000 more died in the weeks that followed from injuries and the disease that swept through the survivors camped out in the wreckage. Ministers on both sides of the Atlantic, including in Boston, wrote that the disaster was self-evidently divine judgment on a town that had built its fortune on plunder and vice, which tells you a great deal about how Port Royal's own reputation had already calcified into legend even before it went under. And in a detail that says something uncomfortable about what kind of town Port Royal had trained its survivors to be, some accounts describe looting starting almost immediately, before the rescue effort had even organized itself, with the dead stripped of jewelry and rings cut from swollen fingers in the same streets where, days earlier, men had been giving away entire barrels of wine for free. A credit economy built on trusting that a customer would eventually come back and settle up does not survive a disaster that removes the customers, the buildings, and the ground itself in the same 11 minutes. The business model didn't just take damage that morning, it drowned along with the physical taverns themselves, and the underwater archaeology teams who've spent decades excavating the site since the 1960s have actually pulled up fragments of exactly this economy intact. Entire building complexes containing a pipe shop, a cobbler, and a tavern all sharing one structure, frozen mid-transaction the way volcanic ash froze Pompeii. In the years after the earthquake, Jamaica's colonial economy shifted decisively toward sugar plantations instead, and the deliberate official tolerance of privateering that had built Port Royal in the first place slowly evaporated as London's Caribbean priorities changed. The wickedest city on earth never really came back as what it had been. But the underlying business model, drunk crews with lump sum payouts and a short time horizon, tavern keepers extending credit against the next haul, didn't disappear. It relocated. 2 decades later, 2 things happened almost simultaneously that recreated the exact same conditions somewhere new. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht ended the War of the Spanish Succession, and thousands of sailors who'd spent years working legally as privateers under wartime letters of marque suddenly found their licenses worthless in peacetime, with a very particular, very marketable skill set and no legal way to use it. And the year before that treaty, in 1715, a Spanish treasure fleet wrecked in a hurricane off the coast of Florida, scattering an enormous quantity of silver across shallow water, which drew salvage crews, official and unofficial, from across the Caribbean, some of whom, a young captain named Henry Jennings among them, simply decided it was easier to rob the official Spanish salvage camps than to dive for the coins themselves. One of the men who cut his teeth on those very same raids was a captain named Charles Vane, and he's going to matter again in about 2 minutes. Between roughly 1706 and 1718, this newly unemployed, newly armed, newly experienced population of ex-privateers and treasure fleet raiders converged on the harbor at Nassau, on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, a place with almost no permanent British government presence to get in the way. What grew there is remembered, somewhat romantically, as the Republic of Pirates, and while it was never a republic in any formal legal sense, it really did run on an informal, negotiated code, crews voting on their own captains, different pirate crews agreeing to treat each other with basic civility rather than turning on one another in port. And underneath that self-governing arrangement sat the exact same tavern economy Port Royal had pioneered a generation earlier, minus the one thing Port Royal had that Nassau never really had: an official government taking its own cut and, in exchange, keeping some kind of lid on things. Contemporary descriptions of Nassau harbor in these years describe a town thick with the smell of rotting seaweed, unwashed bodies, and drying blood, taverns overflowing with men loudly reliving their last successful raid, merchants trading cautiously with customers who might just as easily rob them as pay them. It was the Port Royal model running with no governor at all, which made it lucrative and genuinely lawless in roughly equal measure. Edward Teach, the pirate the world would come to know as Blackbeard, was among the regulars drinking and spending in that harbor during these same years, before he went on to build the reputation that's kept his name alive 3 centuries later, which gives you some sense of just how concentrated this particular stretch of beach had become. That arrangement lasted about 12 years, and it ended the way these things tend to end, not with a battle, but with a piece of paper backed by warships. In 1718, the British Crown appointed Woodes Rogers, a former privateer captain, as the first royal governor of the Bahamas, and he arrived in Nassau already famous for something else entirely: a 3-year privateering circumnavigation of the globe he'd led a decade earlier, during which his expedition rescued a marooned Scottish sailor named Alexander Selkirk from an uninhabited island in the Pacific, the real castaway whose story would go on to inspire Daniel Defoe's novel Robinson Crusoe. Rogers understood the pirate share economy he was being sent to dismantle in a way almost no other government governor could have because he'd been badly burned by an ordinary version of it himself. When his own circumnavigation finally returned to England, his crew sued him, claiming they hadn't been paid their fair contracted shares of the voyage's plunder, and the resulting legal fight helped push Rogers into personal bankruptcy despite having just completed one of the most celebrated privateering voyages in English history. The man sent to Nassau to break up an informal economy built on disputed shares had already lost a fortune to a dispute over shares of his own. Rogers arrived in Nassau with two things in hand: a formal royal pardon known as the King's Pardon, or the Acts of Grace, and enough naval force to make refusing it a genuinely bad idea. Rogers' own chosen motto for the colony, adopted then and still the official motto of the Bahamas today, translates roughly as "pirates expelled, commerce restored," which is about as blunt a statement of the actual economic argument as any government has ever put on a coat of arms. Hundreds of pirates took the deal. Benjamin Hornigold, one of Nassau's own founding captains, accepted the pardon and then, in one of history's cleaner ironies, went to work for Rogers hunting down his own former comrades who hadn't, capturing a crew led by a minor pirate named John Auger, 9 of whom were publicly hanged in Nassau that December, to make the new arrangement unmistakably clear to anyone still thinking it over. Charles Vane, the same man who'd learned the trade-robbing Spanish salvage crews back in 1715, refused the pardon outright, fired on Rogers' own ships to escape Nassau Harbor, and kept raiding for 2 more years while the pirate republic collapsed around him. A hurricane finally ended his run in 1719, stranding him alone on an uninhabited island until a passing ship's crew recognized him and turned him in. He was tried, convicted, and on the 29th of March, 1721, he was hanged at Gallows Point in Port Royal, Jamaica, the exact same town, on the exact same stretch of harbor, where this entire boom and bust industry had first taken shape 66 years earlier. His body was gibbeted at the harbor entrance afterward, a visible warning to any ship sailing in, standing more or less on top of a business district that had already sunk into the sea once, run by men whose entire economic model was built on the assumption that today's payday might genuinely be the last one they'd ever get. So here's the final accounting, and it's less about pirates than it sounds like it should be. A pirate port tavern never made its real money selling rum to men celebrating a good raid. It made its money doing something closer to underwriting, extending short-term, high-interest, entirely informal credit to a customer base with an unusually short and unusually well-understood life expectancy, in a market so oversaturated with competing taverns that trust and repeat business mattered more than price. That model could produce extraordinary profits fast, precisely because it was built on exactly the same instability that eventually destroyed it twice over. Once when the ground itself gave out from under Port Royal in a matter of minutes, and once when a single governor sailed into Nassau Harbor with a pardon in one hand and a fleet in the other, and simply decided the party was over. The rum was never the business. The business was betting on men who already knew, better than their tavern keeper ever could, exactly how short their odds really were.